After my husband's funeral, my sister-in-law drove me to a remote road and said, "This is where you get off. The house and business are mine now." She spat before speeding away. Stranded, penniless, I clutched my bag, then smiled. She thought she'd won. But she didn't know what I'd done before her brother died. "I'm sorry for your loss, but we need to discuss business." Those words, spoken while David's casket was still being lowered into the ground, should have prepared me for what was coming. Rachel had pulled me aside during my husband's funeral, her manicured hand gripping my arm like a vice, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "The transition needs to happen quickly. David wouldn't have wanted the company to suffer because of sentiment." I stared at her in disbelief. My husband had been dead for exactly 4 hours, and she was already planning to take everything we'd built together. ## heading 1. The perfect storm builds. I should have seen it then, the way her eyes flickered with something that wasn't grief. But I was drowning in my own sorrow, barely keeping my head above water as friends and family offered their condolences around David's grave. The October wind cut through my black dress, and all I could think about was how David would have made some joke about Chicago weather to lighten the mood. He always knew how to make me smile even in the darkest moments. But there would be no more smiles from David. No more late-night conversations about expanding our business. No more stolen kisses in our home office when we thought no one was looking. Rachel's grip on my arm tightened, pulling me back to the present. "Maya, are you listening? This is important." I looked at her, then really looked at her for the first time in years. David's sister stood there in a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her blonde hair was styled flawlessly despite the wind, her makeup unsmudged by tears. She looked like she was attending a business conference, not burying her brother. "Rachel, please," I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying. "Can we talk about this later? I can't think about business right now." Her smile was razor thin. "Unfortunately, business doesn't wait for grief, Maya. Collins Tech Solutions needs leadership, and David left very specific instructions about what should happen." That was a lie. I knew it was a lie because David and I had updated our wills together just 6 months earlier. We'd sat in our attorney's office, holding hands while we discussed what would happen to our company if something happened to one of us. The business would go to the surviving spouse with provisions for key employees. Rachel wasn't mentioned in any business capacity. But standing there in that cemetery with dirt still falling on my husband's coffin, I didn't have the strength to argue. I nodded weakly and let her lead me away from the grave site, away from the small group of mourners who were beginning to disperse. It hadn't always been like this between Rachel and me. In the beginning, I'd actually hoped we might become close. When David first introduced us 16 years ago, I was eager to be part of his family. I'd grown up as an only child, and the idea of having a sister was appealing. I remember that first meeting so clearly. David had been nervous, adjusting his tie 3 times before we walked into the upscale restaurant where Rachel was waiting. She was already seated at the best table, checking her phone with an air of practiced impatience. "Rach, I'd like you to meet Maya," David had said, his voice warm with love and pride. "The woman I've been telling you about." Rachel had looked up from her phone, and I'd seen her take inventory of everything about me in about 3 seconds. My off-the-rack dress, my modest jewelry, my nervous smile. I'd felt like a specimen under a microscope. "So you're the receptionist," she'd said, not even trying to hide her dismissal. "Actually, I'm David's business partner now," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Her laugh had been like breaking glass. "How sweet. You're playing office." David had jumped in then, explaining how I'd helped him recover crucial data, how my organizational skills were transforming his chaotic one-man operation into something sustainable. But I could see Rachel tuning out, already deciding I wasn't worth her attention. Over the years, that dismissive attitude had only grown worse. At every family gathering, every holiday dinner, Rachel found ways to remind me that I was an outsider. She'd talk about family memories that predated me, use inside jokes I didn't understand, and consistently refer to the Collins family business, as if I weren't sitting right there. David tried to shield me from it, bless him. He'd change the subject when Rachel got too cutting, or create excuses for us to leave early when the tension became unbearable. But he also made endless excuses for her behavior. "She's just protective of family," he'd say during our drive home from yet another uncomfortable dinner. She'll come around once she gets to know you better. But Rachel never wanted to get to know me better. What she wanted was for me to disappear. The irony was that while she was treating me like an unwelcome guest, David and I were building something extraordinary together. Our tech consulting firm had started in my tiny studio apartment, with David coding on an ancient laptop while I handled client calls from my kitchen table. Those early days were magical in their own way. We'd work 18-hour stretches fueled by coffee and shared dreams, debugging software while sharing stories about our childhoods. David would explain complex programming concepts while I taught him about cash flow management and client psychology. We were perfect complements. His technical brilliance paired with my business instincts. Our first major client was a small medical practice that needed a better patient management system. David built something beautiful and functional, but it was my suggestion to add automated appointment reminders that really sold the contract. That little feature, born from my understanding of human nature, became a signature element in all our subsequent projects. By our second year, we'd moved to a proper office space and hired our first employee. By year 5, we had a full team and clients across 3 states. By year 8, Collins Tech Solutions was valued at $12 million, with a client list that included hospitals, financial firms, and government agencies. Through it all, Rachel watched from the sidelines, cycling through her own failed ventures while criticizing ours. She'd gone through a boutique clothing store, a high-end catering business, an organic skincare line, and most recently, a wellness retreat in Malibu. Each failure was followed by a phone call to David, asking for another loan to get back on her feet. David always said yes. It was one of our few sources of conflict. "She's family, Maya," he'd say whenever I gently suggested that maybe continuous bailouts weren't helping Rachel learn from her mistakes. "She just needs the right opportunity." I bit my tongue, but privately I thought Rachel's real problem wasn't lack of opportunity, it was lack of commitment. She treated businesses like expensive hobbies, moving on to the next shiny idea whenever the current one required actual work. 6 months ago, she'd shown up on our doorstep after her latest failure, looking uncharacteristically humble. The wellness retreat had collapsed amid allegations of financial mismanagement, and she was effectively broke again. David, generous as always, had offered her our guest room and a temporary position at Collins Tech. "Maybe this is what she needs," he'd said to me privately. "A chance to see how a successful business actually operates." I'd had my doubts, but I'd supported his decision. Family was important to David, and I loved him enough to welcome his sister into our home and business, despite our history. Looking back now, standing in that cemetery with Rachel's fingers still digging into my arm, I realized how naive I'd been. Rachel hadn't come home to learn or heal. She'd come home to position herself for exactly this moment. "Hiya," she said now, her voice cutting through my memories. "I know this is difficult, but David was very specific about his wishes. He wanted the business to stay in Collins' family hands." I stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time the calculation behind her grief-stricken facade. The pieces were falling into place. Her sudden interest in our business operations, her detailed questions about client contracts and financial procedures, her insistence on accessing David's computer to help with administrative tasks. She hadn't been helping. She'd been preparing. And now, with David barely cold in the ground, she was making her move. The drive home from the cemetery felt endless. Rachel had finally released her grip on my arm, but I could still feel the indentations her fingers had left. She rode in the passenger seat of my car, speaking in hushed, urgent tones about necessary transitions and protecting David's legacy, while I gripped the steering wheel and tried to process what was happening. 3 weeks. It had only been 3 weeks since that terrible Tuesday morning when my entire world collapsed in the span of heartbeats. I'd been upstairs getting dressed for a client presentation when I heard the crash. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed through our house, followed by a heavy thud that made my stomach drop. I'd called David's name as I rushed downstairs, expecting to find broken dishes and maybe a sheepish apology. Instead, I found my husband lying motionless on our kitchen floor, surrounded by the remnants of his favorite coffee mug, the one I'd given him for our 5th wedding anniversary with "World's Best Business Partner," printed in fading blue letters. "David!" I'd screamed, dropping to my knees beside him. His eyes were closed, his face an alarming shade of gray. I pressed my ear to his chest, listening desperately for a heartbeat while my hands shook so violently I could barely dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? My husband collapsed. I'd managed to choke out. He's not responsive. Please, you have to help him. The dispatcher's voice had been calm and professional, walking me through CPR while sirens wailed in the distance. I'd pumped David's chest and breathed into his lungs, tasting the lingering flavor of his morning coffee, willing him to come back to me with every compression. The paramedics had arrived in what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. They'd worked over David with efficient urgency, their equipment beeping and humming while I stood pressed against the kitchen wall, watching them fight for his life on our hardwood floor. "Ma'am, we need to transport him immediately," the lead paramedic had said. "You can follow us to Northwestern Memorial." Those next 6 hours in the hospital waiting room had been the longest of my life. I'd paced the sterile corridors, called our employees to cancel meetings, and stared at my phone hoping for miracle updates that never came. David's colleagues from his old tech job had shown up, along with our neighbors and a few close friends. Everyone spoke in hushed whispers, offering coffee I couldn't drink and comfort I couldn't accept. Dr. Martinez had finally emerged from the cardiac unit at 3:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I'd been watching the clock obsessively, as if keeping track of minutes could somehow change the outcome. "Mrs. Collins," he'd said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm very sorry. Your husband suffered a massive myocardial infarction. We did everything we could, but the damage was too extensive. He's gone." Gone. Such a simple word for something so devastating. The days that followed were a blur of impossible decisions and suffocating grief. I had to plan a funeral while my brain felt wrapped in cotton. Choose flowers for a man who'd always brought me wildflowers from our backyard. Write an obituary that somehow captured 45 years of life in a few paragraphs. Notify clients and employees while barely able to string coherent sentences together. Our business manager, Sarah, had been a godsend during those dark days. She'd handled the immediate client concerns while I dealt with funeral arrangements, shielding me from the worst of the business chaos. But even her competent support couldn't fill the David-shaped hole in every aspect of my existence. The most surreal part was that life kept moving forward. Clients still needed their projects completed. Bills still needed paying. The world continued spinning while mine had stopped completely. But there was something else haunting me during those grief-stricken weeks. Something that had happened 3 days before David's heart attack. A phone call that now seemed like prophecy. I'd been reviewing quarterly reports when David burst into our home office, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. He'd been carrying a stack of bank statements and printouts, his hands trembling with emotion. "Maya, we need to talk," he'd said, closing the door behind him with unusual force. "It's about Rachel." The urgency in his voice had made me set aside my work immediately. David rarely got truly angry, but when he did, it was usually about something serious. "What's wrong?" I'd asked, though part of me already suspected. "She's been stealing from us," he'd said, spreading the documents across my desk. "For months. Maybe longer. Look at these withdrawals. They're all authorized with my signature, but I never signed any of them." I'd studied the papers with growing horror. Withdrawal after withdrawal, ranging from $500 to $15,000, all supposedly signed by David during times when he was traveling for business conferences or client meetings. The forged signatures were good, almost perfect replicas of his handwriting, but there were subtle differences that became obvious once you knew what to look for. "How much?" I'd whispered. "So far. Over $800,000, David had said, sinking into his chair. "And there might be more." I only discovered this because I was trying to reconcile some discrepancies in our quarterly taxes. We'd spent that entire evening building a case, documenting every fraudulent transaction, cross-referencing them with David's travel schedule, compiling evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic embezzlement. David had been heartbroken, not just about the money but about the betrayal. "She's my sister," he'd kept saying as if repetition could make it make sense. "How could she do this to us? To family?" We'd decided to secure all the evidence before confronting Rachel directly. David had wanted to give her a chance to explain, maybe even make restitution if she was genuinely remorseful. I'd been less optimistic about her potential for remorse, but I'd supported his decision to handle things quietly. "We'll talk to her tomorrow," David had said that final night, kissing me goodnight in our home office where we'd spent so many happy hours building our dreams together. Tomorrow never came. The next morning, David was gone. In the weeks following his death, I'd found myself returning to those documents obsessively. Partly it was practical. I needed to understand the full scope of Rachel's theft for legal purposes. But mostly it was emotional. Working on the case felt like continuing a conversation with David, honoring his last request to protect what we'd built together. What I discovered was worse than we'd initially realized. Rachel hadn't just been stealing cash. She'd been siphoning money through fake vendor payments, inflated expense reports and phantom consulting fees. The total damage was approaching $1.2 million, nearly 10% of our company's value. She'd gotten bolder after David's death, probably assuming I was too grief-stricken to notice financial irregularities. But grief had actually sharpened my focus in some ways. I had nothing else to think about except the mystery David had left me to solve. Meanwhile, Rachel had been playing the role of grieving sister with Oscar-worthy performance. She'd sobbed dramatically at the funeral, clutching my hand during the eulogy and whispering about how much she'd miss her baby brother. She'd brought me meals I couldn't eat and offered to handle business communications I couldn't face. But I'd started noticing things. The way she'd volunteered to help with tasks that involved accessing our financial systems. Her sudden interest in meeting with our attorney and accountant. The subtle questions about life insurance policies and business succession plans. Now, sitting in my car after that cemetery conversation, I finally understood what I'd been witnessing. Rachel's grief was genuine, but not for David. She was mourning the lost opportunity to steal even more before her brother discovered her crimes. And now she thought she could simply take everything legally, using forged documents and my grief-induced vulnerability to complete the theft she'd started months ago. He was wrong. David might be gone, but the case we'd built together was bulletproof. Rachel had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd underestimated the widow she thought she could easily manipulate. I was about to prove just how wrong she was. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching the hollow feeling in my chest. I'd barely slept, my mind cycling between memories of David and the growing certainty that Rachel was orchestrating something far worse than simple theft. When I shuffled downstairs in my robe at 7 a.m., I found her already dressed for business in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. She was sitting at our kitchen table with her laptop open, a stack of manila folders arranged beside her coffee cup. The sight was jarring. This woman treating our home like her personal boardroom barely 12 hours after we'd buried David. "Good morning, Maya," she said without looking up from her screen. "I hope you got some rest. We have a lot to discuss today." I poured myself coffee with shaking hands, noticing she'd made the expensive imported blend David always said tasted like pretentious water. Another small violation that somehow felt enormous. "Rachel, I'm not sure I'm ready to." "I understand this is difficult," she interrupted, closing her laptop with a decisive snap. "But delaying won't make it easier. David's clients are already asking questions about continuity of service. We need to establish clear leadership before they start jumping ship." The casual way she said "we" made my stomach turn. As if she'd been running Collins Tech Solutions all along instead of living in our guest room and stealing our money. "Maybe we should wait until Tom Henderson gets back from his daughter's wedding," I suggested, testing whether she'd stick to her lie from yesterday. Rachel's smile didn't waver. "Actually, I spoke with Tom yesterday evening. He's cutting his trip short to handle this transition. Very professional of him, don't you think?" Another lie. I'd called Tom's office again that morning, and his secretary confirmed he wouldn't return until Thursday. But I kept my expression neutral, letting Rachel think I was buying her deception. "Now," she continued, opening the first folder with theatrical precision, "let's review the partnership restructuring that David and I discussed last month." She slid a thick document across the table. The header read Collins Tech Solutions Partnership Amendment, in official-looking typeface. My name appeared throughout the text, but always in subordinate positions: junior partner, administrative coordinator, operations assistant. "I don't understand," I said, though I understood perfectly. "David and I were equal partners. We started this company together." Rachel's expression shifted to something that might have been pity if it weren't so condescending. "Maya, I know David let you feel important, but let's be realistic about your actual contributions. You handled some clerical work, answered phones, did basic bookkeeping. David was the visionary, the technical genius. Without him, what specialized skills do you actually bring to the table? The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to undermine my confidence. But beneath my grief, something harder was crystallizing. Rachel wasn't just stealing money, she was trying to steal my identity, rewrite the history of everything David and I had accomplished together. These signatures, I said, studying the documents more carefully. When exactly did David sign these? October 15th, Rachel replied smoothly. He was very concerned about the company's future, especially with his health concerns. October 15th. I remembered that date clearly because it was the day of our biggest client presentation of the year. David and I had spent 14 hours straight preparing financial projections and technical specifications for a potential $2 million contract. He'd been completely focused on that presentation, stressed about every detail. The idea that he'd taken time that day to restructure our partnership without mentioning it to me was absurd. But the signature looked right. Almost right. The D in David was slightly too rounded, the S in Collins a fraction too straight. Someone had practiced his handwriting extensively, but they'd missed the subtle imperfections that made his signature uniquely his. Here's what I'm prepared to offer, Rachel continued, opening another folder. A generous buyout of $500,000, plus a consulting contract if you want to stay involved in a limited capacity. You could handle basic administrative tasks, answer phones, that sort of thing. $500,000. For a company we'd built to a $12 million valuation. For 8 years of 16-hour days, for every late night we'd spent debugging code and strategizing growth, for every client relationship I'd nurtured from cold calls to million-dollar contracts. That seems... I paused, choosing my words carefully, lower than I would have expected. Rachel's laugh was sharp. Maya, you're thinking emotionally, not rationally. Yes, the company has revenue, but revenue isn't profit. And without David's technical expertise, how much is that client base really worth? Most of our contracts were based on personal relationships with David. When word gets out that he's gone. She let the implication hang in the air. It was a threat disguised as business analysis, and we both knew it. I'd need time to review this with our attorney, I said carefully. Of course, Rachel nodded. Tom's already reviewed everything actually. He agrees this is the most sensible path forward. Family businesses can be complicated when there's a death, and this way everyone's interests are protected. Another lie. Tom Henderson was meticulous about documentation, and he would never review major partnership changes without involving all parties. But Rachel was betting on my grief making me compliant, too overwhelmed to question her version of events. There's something else we need to discuss, she continued, her tone shifting to false sympathy. The house. My blood went cold. What about the house? Well, it's quite large for one person, don't you think? And expensive to maintain. David always worried about you being financially secure if something happened to him. I found some research he'd done on nice condominiums downtown, much more appropriate for a single woman your age. She produced printouts from real estate websites, all featuring sterile-looking apartments that cost a third of what our house was worth. David's supposed research was dated 3 days before his heart attack, during the same period when he'd been consumed with discovering Rachel's theft. David loved this house, I said quietly. We chose it together. Why would he want me to sell it? Maya, sweetie, Rachel's voice took on that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. David was practical. He knew you'd need liquid assets more than you'd need all this space and responsibility. And frankly, staying here might just make the grieving process harder. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what someone needs. Every word was poison wrapped in fake concern. She wasn't just planning to steal the business, she wanted the house too. Our home, where David and I had shared breakfast every morning for 8 years, where we'd celebrated every business milestone, where his presence still lingered in every room. I'll need to think about all this, I said, standing up from the table. It's a lot to process. Of course it is, Rachel agreed, but I caught the flash of irritation that crossed her face. She'd expected me to sign immediately, too grief-stricken to think clearly. But Maya, we really can't delay too long. The business world moves fast and our competitors are probably already circling. David wouldn't want his life's work to suffer because of sentiment. That word again. Sentiment. As if love and loyalty were weaknesses to be overcome rather than the foundation of everything meaningful in life. I understand, I lied, gathering the documents she'd given me. Let me review everything carefully tonight. As I headed upstairs, I heard Rachel making phone calls in our kitchen, her voice crisp and businesslike. She was talking to someone about finalizing the transition and moving forward with the acquisition timeline. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed David and I had shared for 8 years and spread Rachel's fraudulent documents across the comforter. Every page was a masterpiece of deception, crafted to look legitimate while systematically stripping away everything I'd worked for. But Rachel had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated my memory for details, my understanding of our business timeline, and most importantly, my knowledge of David's habits and handwriting. Every lie she'd told had a specific date, a verifiable fact I could check. And I still had the evidence David and I had compiled together, proof of her months-long embezzlement scheme, documented with the same meticulous attention to detail we'd applied to every aspect of our business. Rachel thought she was manipulating a grieving widow who'd be too overwhelmed to fight back. She had no idea she was dealing with a woman who'd spent 8 years learning how to build bulletproof cases against fraudsters. The war was just beginning and I had weapons she didn't even know existed. 2 days later, Rachel knocked on my bedroom door at 8 in the morning, her voice artificially cheerful through the wood. Maya? I thought we could handle that paperwork today. Get it all sorted out so you can start moving forward. I'd been expecting this. After our kitchen table confrontation, I'd watched her grow increasingly impatient with my requests for time to think things over. She needed my signature on those fraudulent documents and she was done waiting. I'm not sure I'm ready, I called back, playing the role of the overwhelmed widow she expected. Sweetie, I know it's hard, but delaying won't make it easier, she replied. I've arranged for us to meet with Tom Henderson this morning. He's back from his trip early just for us. Another lie. I'd confirmed that Tom was still in Florida, probably walking his daughter down the aisle at that very moment. But I needed to see where Rachel was going with this deception. Okay, I said, opening the door. Let me get dressed. Rachel was standing in the hallway wearing designer jeans and a silk blouse, casual clothes that somehow looked more expensive than most people's formal wear. Her smile was warm and concerned, the perfect mask for whatever she had planned. Take your time, she said. I'll make us some coffee for the drive. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of Rachel's BMW, watching familiar neighborhoods disappear behind us. She'd been chattering nervously about the weather, about how proud David would be that we're handling everything so maturely, about the bright future ahead once all this legal stuff was settled. But we weren't heading downtown toward the financial district where Tom Henderson's office was located. Instead, Rachel was taking rural routes through the outer suburbs, past sprawling farms and industrial complexes. Is this a shortcut? I asked, though my gut already knew the answer. Construction on the main highway, Rachel replied smoothly, not taking her eyes off the road. This way's actually faster, believe it or not. Sometimes the back roads are better than the obvious routes. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Rachel had always preferred back roads, indirect approaches, manipulation over confrontation. But something about her energy today felt different. More urgent, more desperate. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and she kept checking the rearview mirror as if she expected to be followed. We drove in silence for another 10 minutes, the landscape growing increasingly isolated. Cornfields stretched endlessly on both sides of the 2-lane road, broken only by occasional farmhouses set back behind long gravel driveways. My phone showed no signal bars. We were genuinely in the middle of nowhere. Rachel, where exactly are we going? I asked, no longer bothering to hide the concern in my voice. She glanced at me then, and for just a moment her mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes, something that made my blood freeze. Somewhere we can have a final conversation, she said, her voice dropping the fake sweetness. Without interruptions. Without you running to lawyers or friends or anyone else who might complicate things. She pulled off the main road onto a gravel shoulder beside an empty field. The car crunched to a stop and suddenly the silence was deafening. No traffic, no houses visible in any direction, just endless rows of harvested corn stubble stretching to the horizon. Rachel turned to face me fully and the transformation was complete. Gone was the grieving sister, the concerned family member, the woman who'd brought me tissues and soup during my darkest days. In her place sat a stranger with dead eyes and a predator's smile. "Here's how this is going to work, Maya," she said, her voice calm and businesslike. "You're going to sign these documents transferring the business to me. You're going to accept my generous buyout offer. And then you're going to disappear quietly from all our lives." "And if I don't?" I asked, though I already knew. Rachel's laugh was like breaking glass. "Look around you, sweetheart. We're 20 miles from the nearest town. Your phone has no signal. Nobody knows where you are except me." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "David's gone, Maya. You're nobody without him. Just some small-town girl who got lucky for a few years. You have no family, no real friends, no one who would miss you if you just vanished." Each word was chosen to wound, to strip away what little confidence I had left. She'd been studying me for months, learning my insecurities, mapping my vulnerabilities. This wasn't just theft, it was psychological warfare. "You're sick," I said quietly. "I'm practical," she corrected. David was weak, always letting sentiment cloud his judgment. He should have gotten rid of you years ago, but he was too soft. Too romantic. Well, romance doesn't pay the bills, does it? She reached across me to the glove compartment, pulling out a small digital recorder. "I've been documenting your increasingly erratic behavior since David's death," she said, pressing play. My own voice filled the car, but the words were wrong, taken out of context and edited to make me sound unstable, paranoid, possibly suicidal. "Amazing what you can do with technology these days," Rachel said, stopping the playback. "If you disappear, everyone will understand why. The grieving widow, overwhelmed by loss, making poor decisions." Very sad, but not entirely surprising. The full scope of her plan was becoming clear. This wasn't just about stealing the business. She was planning to erase me completely, creating a narrative that would explain my absence while positioning herself as the tragic but capable survivor picking up the pieces. My hands were shaking, but not with fear. With rage. This woman had stolen from us, betrayed David's trust, and now she was threatening to destroy me entirely. She'd planned every detail, from the isolated location to the fabricated evidence that would cover her tracks. But she'd made one crucial error. "iPhone," I said. Rachel's smile widened. "What about it?" Before I could answer, she grabbed my purse and pulled out my iPhone, tossing it out her open window. I watched it shatter against the gravel, pieces of glass and metal scattering across the road shoulder. "Oops," she said with mock concern. "Clumsy me. Guess you'll have to walk to find help." She reached across me and opened my door, the October wind rushing in to cut through my light jacket. "This is where you get off, Maya. The house and business are mine now. David's gone and you're nothing without him." I felt her hand on my shoulder, pushing me toward the open door. "You can walk to that gas station about 3 miles back. Catch a ride somewhere. Start over. But if you try to contest anything, if you cause any trouble, I'll make sure you regret it." I stumbled out of the car, my feet hitting the gravel with a crunch that seemed unnaturally loud in the empty landscape. Rachel tossed my purse after me, then leaned out the window with that cruel smile still playing on her lips. "David always said you were tougher than you looked," she said. "Let's see how tough you really are when you have nothing." The car sped away, leaving me standing alone in a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes. I watched the BMW disappear around a bend, taking with it everything I thought I knew about human decency. But as the dust settled and silence returned to the empty road, something unexpected happened. Instead of the despair Rachel had counted on, I felt something else entirely. A strange sense of liberation, even triumph. Because clutched in my purse, protected in a waterproof case, was the encrypted drive containing months of evidence that would destroy Rachel's carefully constructed plans. She thought she'd abandoned a helpless widow on a deserted road. She'd actually just made the biggest mistake of her life. I smiled, shouldered my purse and started walking. The first mile was the hardest. My dress shoes weren't made for gravel roads, and the October wind cut through my jacket like razor blades. But with each step my resolve grew stronger. Rachel had counted on breaking me with that roadside abandonment, leaving me stranded and helpless. Instead, she'd freed me from any remaining loyalty or family obligation. The second mile brought clarity. As I walked past empty cornfields, I mentally catalogued every piece of evidence David and I had compiled, every forged signature Rachel had created, every lie she told. She thought she was so clever, but she'd left a digital trail that would destroy her. By the third mile, I had a complete battle plan. Miller's gas station appeared like a mirage on the horizon. A weathered building with faded signs advertising lottery tickets and cold beer. The elderly man behind the counter looked up from his crossword puzzle as I pushed through the door, his face immediately creasing with concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, taking in my disheveled appearance and probably recognizing the look of someone who'd been through something traumatic. "You look like you've been walking a while." "My car broke down," I said, which was technically true. "Could I possibly use your phone?" "It's an emergency." "Of course, honey." He gestured toward an old landline behind the counter. "Take your time. You want some coffee? You look half frozen." His kindness nearly broke me. After Rachel's cruelty, this stranger's simple human decency felt like a lifeline. I accepted the coffee gratefully and dialed Tom Henderson's personal cell phone number. "Maya." Tom's voice was surprised and concerned. "I just got your message. I'm still in Florida, but I can catch the first flight back if this is urgent." "What's this about Rachel presenting documents I supposedly approved?" "Tom, Rachel has been lying about everything," I said, my voice steady despite everything I'd been through. "She's forged David's signature on partnership transfer documents, and she's been embezzling from the company for months. I have proof." There was a long pause. "Maya, those are serious accusations. Are you absolutely certain?" "David discovered the theft 3 days before he died," I said. "We documented everything together. I have encrypted files with bank records, forged signatures, fake invoices, everything needed to prove she's been stealing from us systematically." "My God," Tom breathed. "Where are you now? Are you safe?" I told him about the roadside abandonment, about Rachel's threats, about her plan to erase me entirely from the business David and I had built together. Tom's language became increasingly colorful as I described what had happened. "I'm booking the next flight to Chicago," he said. "Don't talk to Rachel, don't sign anything, and don't go home alone. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., and bring everything you have." After hanging up, I called Sarah, our business manager, who immediately offered to pick me up. When she arrived 20 minutes later, her face was white with shock. "Maya, my God, what happened to you?" she asked, helping me into her car. "Rachel showed her true colors," I said simply. "Sarah, I need you to secure all of our financial systems immediately. Change every password, freeze any accounts Rachel has access to, and back up everything to our secure server." Sarah nodded grimly. "I've been wondering about some irregular transactions lately. Small things that didn't quite add up. Should I document everything but don't confront her directly?" I interrupted. "We're going to handle this legally, and we need to make sure she can't destroy evidence or steal anything else." The next morning, I sat in Tom Henderson's office with my laptop open, showing him file after file of incriminating evidence. His expression grew darker with each document I displayed. "This is extraordinary," he said, studying a spreadsheet that cross-referenced Rachel's forged withdrawals with David's travel schedule. "The level of documentation here is prosecutorial quality. How did you compile all this without her knowing?" "David was methodical about everything," I replied. "When he discovered the first discrepancies, we treated it like any other business problem. Gather data, analyze patterns, build a case. We just never got the chance to confront her before he died." Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from lawyer to strategist. "Maya, this goes far beyond civil fraud. We're talking federal crimes here. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy. This needs to go to the FBI immediately." "Will they take it seriously?" I asked. "With documentation like this? They'll take it very seriously indeed." 2 hours later, I was sitting across from FBI Special Agent Jennifer Martinez at the federal building downtown. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened intently as I walked through months of evidence. "Mrs. Collins," she said after reviewing the encrypted drive, "this is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've seen in years. Your late husband was quite thorough." "We both were," I corrected gently. This was our life's work she was stealing. Agent Martinez nodded. "We'll need to move quickly. Financial crimes like this often involve flight risks, especially when the perpetrator realizes they've been caught. Do you have any reason to believe Ms. Collins might try to leave the country?" "Actually, yes," I said, remembering Rachel's nervous energy during our car ride. She's been acting increasingly desperate lately, and she has connections in Los Angeles. She might have an exit strategy planned. We'll put a flag on her passport immediately, Agent Martinez said. In the meantime, I need you to act normally. If she contacts you, don't let on that you've spoken with us. Can you do that? I nodded, though the idea of pretending normalcy with the woman who'd abandoned me on a roadside felt surreal. Rachel's first call came that afternoon while I was at the office, working with Sarah to assess the full scope of the financial damage. Her voice was artificially sweet when I answered. Maya, sweetheart, I've been so worried about you, she said. When you didn't come home last night, I thought something terrible might have happened. Where have you been? I stayed with a friend, I lied smoothly. I needed some space to think about everything. Of course you did. Listen, I've been thinking too, and maybe I was a bit hasty with the timeline yesterday. If you need more time to process the partnership changes, I understand. Family is more important than business after all. The complete reversal in her tone told me everything I needed to know. Something had spooked her. Maybe she tried to access accounts that Sarah had already locked down, or perhaps she'd realized her fake lawyer consultations could be easily verified. That's very understanding of you, Rachel, I said, playing along. Maybe we could meet tomorrow to discuss everything more calmly. Absolutely, she agreed, relief evident in her voice. Why don't you come by the house around noon? We can have lunch and work everything out like family should. After hanging up, I immediately called Agent Martinez. She wants to meet tomorrow. She knows something's wrong. Perfect, the agent replied. That gives us tonight to execute search warrants. By the time you meet with her, we'll have everything we need. The next morning, my phone rang at 6 a.m. Rachel's voice was panicked, all pretense of sweetness gone. Maya, we need to talk right now, she said, her words tumbling over each other. There's been a misunderstanding. People are asking questions about financial irregularities, but I can explain everything. We can work this out. Through my bedroom window, I could see FBI vehicles surrounding our house. Agent Martinez had warned me this would happen. I'm sorry, Rachel, I said quietly, but I think it's too late for explanations. The line went dead. 3 hours later, Agent Martinez called to inform me that Rachel had been arrested at O'Hare Airport, attempting to board a one-way flight to Costa Rica with $300,000 in cash and fake identification documents. Justice, it seemed, moved swiftly when you had 18 months of evidence gift-wrapped for federal investigators. The recovery of our stolen assets took longer, but it was thorough. Rachel had hidden money in offshore accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, and safe deposit boxes across 3 states. All of it was traced, frozen, and eventually returned to Collins Tech Solutions. Standing in Tom Henderson's office 6 weeks later, signing the final papers that restored complete control of our company to me, I felt David's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. We'd built something worth fighting for, and that fight had been won with the evidence he'd helped me gather in our final days together. Rachel had tried to steal our legacy. Instead, she'd given me the strength to protect it. The morning after signing those final papers, I walked into the Collins Tech Solutions office as its sole owner for the first time. The familiar hum of servers and the soft clicking of keyboards greeted me, but everything felt different now. This wasn't just the company David and I had built together anymore. It was my responsibility, my future, my chance to prove that Rachel's cruel assessment of my worth had been spectacularly wrong. Sarah was waiting in my office with coffee and a stack of client files, her expression a mixture of relief and determination. So, boss, she said with a slight smile, where do we start? The transition wasn't seamless. Losing David had created gaps in our technical capabilities that I needed to address immediately. Our clients had been patient during the crisis, but patience has limits in the business world. I needed someone who could fill David's shoes, not completely because no one could do that, but someone who understood both the technical demands and the company culture we'd built. The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus Rodriguez had been David's closest friend in graduate school and his partner in their first startup attempt 15 years ago. When their initial venture failed, Marcus had gone to work for a major consulting firm while David and I struck out on our own. He'd followed our success from a distance, and when I called him 3 months after Rachel's arrest, he was ready for a change. Maya, I'm so sorry about David, Marcus said during our first meeting. He was always so proud of what you two built together. He used to say you were the secret weapon that made everything work. Hiring Marcus as our new CTO felt like David giving his blessing from beyond. Marcus understood the technical side, but he also respected the business philosophy David and I had developed. More importantly, he brought fresh perspectives on cybersecurity that would prove prophetic. You know, Marcus said during his second week, what happened with Rachel isn't unique. Internal fraud is epidemic in small to medium-sized businesses. Most owners have no idea how vulnerable they are until it's too late. That conversation planted the seed for what would become our most significant expansion. I'd lived through the nightmare of discovering that someone I trusted had been systematically stealing from us. I'd experienced the fear, the betrayal, the near destruction of everything David and I had worked for. But I'd also learned how to fight back, how to document evidence, how to work with federal investigators to recover stolen assets. Other business owners needed those skills. Within 6 months, we'd launched Collins Cybersecurity Consulting, a specialized division focused on helping companies protect themselves from internal threats. Our first client was a family-owned manufacturing business whose bookkeeper had embezzled $200,000 over 3 years. The owner, Janet Morrison, was a woman in her 60s who'd built the company with her late husband, and watching her relief as we helped recover her stolen money felt like healing a piece of my own trauma. How did you know? Janet asked after we'd identified the fraudulent transactions. How did you spot the patterns my own accountant missed? Because I lived it, I told her simply. I know what betrayal looks like when it's wrapped in fake sympathy and family loyalty. Word spread quickly in Chicago's business community. Companies began reaching out proactively, wanting security audits before they became victims. We developed software tools that could flag suspicious transactions, training programs that helped owners recognize warning signs, and rapid response protocols for businesses that discovered they'd been compromised. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply fulfilling. Every company we protected, every theft we prevented, felt like a victory over the mindset that had nearly destroyed me. Rachel had seen me as weak, expendable, someone whose contributions could be dismissed and erased. Instead, I was using the pain she'd caused to build something stronger and more meaningful than before. The growth was remarkable. Within 2 years, we'd expanded from a $12 million company to $20 million, with offices in 3 states and a waiting list of clients seeking our cybersecurity services. But the numbers were less important than the relationships we were building. I found myself connecting with other widowed entrepreneurs, women who'd lost their partners but refused to let grief define their limits. We formed an informal support network, sharing strategies for managing businesses alone while honoring the memories of the people we'd built them with. Some evenings, we'd meet for dinner and talk about the unique challenges of stepping into leadership roles we'd never expected to fill. One of these women, Dr. Lisa Chin, had lost her husband to cancer 2 years before David died. She'd taken over their medical research company and was struggling with investor relations, an area where David and I had developed significant expertise. I know the science better than anyone, Lisa said during one of our dinners, but when I walk into those boardrooms, I can see them thinking I'm just the widow trying to keep her husband's company alive. So prove them wrong, I said. Not with words, with results. Let your success be your argument. Lisa took that advice and tripled her company's value within 18 months. When she called to thank me, she said something that stayed with me. You taught me that being underestimated can be a competitive advantage. People reveal their true strategies when they think you're not a threat. That conversation inspired me to create the David Collins Memorial Scholarship, focused on supporting underprivileged students in technology fields. David had always believed that talent was equally distributed but opportunity wasn't. The scholarship program became a way to extend that philosophy beyond his lifetime. The first recipient was Maria Santos, a 17-year-old from the South Side whose computer programming skills were extraordinary but whose family couldn't afford college tuition. Watching her graduate 4 years later and start her own software company felt like David's dreams taking flight in ways we'd never imagined. Meanwhile, Rachel's story was unfolding very differently. Agent Martinez kept me informed of the legal proceedings, though I'd requested minimal involvement. Rachel had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Her lawyers had tried to negotiate a plea deal, claiming she'd been overwhelmed by grief and made poor decisions, but the extensive premeditation we documented made that argument impossible. Her attempts to contact me from prison started 8 months into her sentence. Letters filled with apologies and explanations, phone calls I refused to accept, even messages passed through mutual acquaintances. Rachel wanted forgiveness, or perhaps she wanted to plant doubt about her guilt. I wanted neither her apologies nor her justifications. Tom Henderson had advised me that any contact could potentially complicate future legal proceedings if she appealed her conviction. But honestly, my reasons were simpler than legal strategy. Rachel had tried to erase me from my own life, and I'd moved beyond caring about her regret or her fate. The real revelation came 2 years after her sentencing, when I was driving past the spot where she'd abandoned me. I'd been visiting a potential client in the suburbs, and my GPS had routed me down the same rural road where I'd stood in my funeral dress, clutching my purse and watching her drive away. I pulled over at the exact location, gravel crunching under my tires just as it had that terrible day. But standing there in the afternoon sunlight, successful and confident and surrounded by people who respected my abilities, I felt something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Rachel's cruelty had been intended to break me, to reduce me to nothing so she could steal everything David and I had built. Instead, it had freed me from the last vestiges of self-doubt I'd carried about my own capabilities. She'd forced me to stand completely on my own, and I'd discovered that I was stronger than either of us had realized. David would have been proud of what Collins Tech Solutions had become, not just financially but philosophically. We were protecting other families from the betrayal we'd experienced, creating opportunities for young people who reminded me of ourselves when we started, building something that would outlast both of us. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. Rachel had tried to tear down what David and I built together. Instead, I'd used her betrayal as foundation stones for something even better. Standing on that gravel road where she'd left me for dead, I smiled and drove home to the life I'd built from the ashes of her cruelty. If this story of quiet justice had you rooting for Maya, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Maya smiled on that gravel road, clutching the evidence that would destroy Rachel's schemes. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought you were weak? Share your story, I read every comment. Don't miss more incredible revenge stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.